All right. At this point in the project walkthrough, you are here. You have brought up this form, you have launched this form, you have put in your mood, you have put in your prompt, and you're about to hit the ask button, right? And we'll get back into Studio and see what happens when the ask button is clicked. Here there is a trigger file that is named on ask clicked. As usual is the case, the trigger file is associated with the form trigger activity, and then it is triggered when the ask button is clicked on the form named chat, right? That's what this indicates. And then the first thing that follows is you are going to get the user inputs from that form, right? And you get the form values, and those form values are fetched into either local variables or global variables, depending on how you want to manage them in the project. And here, if you look at some of these variables on the right in the value column, you will see that some of those are local scoped, meaning they're local to this trigger file. But wherever you see global variables, dot variable name, those variables are all global in nature, right? That means they can be accessed by this entire application across all the form events that want access to these global variables. And those global variables have been set up in the data manager. You can see them under the global prompt, or the global node rather. And then there are also global constants that I have set up. Again, all of this has been covered before. This is just to give you a bird's eye view of what we are working with, right? So once you have gotten the form values using the get form values activity, this is where the meat of the process actually runs, right? And given the nature of how it works, it has been put into a flow. And the first thing that happens is that the automation checks to see if you have set the mood, right? Now, typically, in a conversation, you set the mood once, and then the mood will be reset after you have ended the conversation. Typically, at least that's how I use it, right? So the first time around, when you post your first question in a conversation, the automation checks for if the mood has been set. Now, if the mood has not been set, then this global variable called mood set will be false, in which case it figures out that this is a new conversation. And at that point, it records the start time of the conversation, and then it moves down to prepare the text that you're set as the mood to a specific format. Now, remember, this time we are sending requests through the API, right? We are not using the OpenAI integration service connector. And therefore, these messages have to be prepared in a certain way, right? And that is where this message to .xaml comes in. What this message to XAML does is that it takes your plain text message and formats it depending on what the role is and what the text message is, right? And that that format is here in the OpenAI APIs, and this is how it looks like. So if you take a generic template, this is how the API template looks like, and this is what we'll be using to compose the API request, right? And if you observe, the first input is the model, the name of the model, and the second is messages. Remember, this is a plural, this is messages, and it is an array of a message object, right? And this message object has to be in a specific format, and several messages can be appended into a single array, right? And if I switch screens, here is an example of something that has already been composed, right? So here is messages, and then you have the square brackets, and in between the square bracket is each message structure, right? So the first message that has been composed is the mood, or the tone of the conversation, right? And that is usually associated with a system role, right? Therefore, the messages XAML will accept the role, in which case it's the system, and then it will accept your message and format the message to look like a system level message. And that is the first message that you will append to this messages array, right? So that is what is happening at this point in the flow, right? You have the start time recorded and a system message is being composed, right? And that system message is now appended to a context history, right? So here it says append system message to a global variable named chat context, right? And what that does is it prepares an array of messages, and those arrays of messages will be built up as you keep prolonging the conversation with the model, right? So for the first time around, this global variables dot chat context will be an empty string, and the first message that will be appended to it will be the system level message or the system role message, right? Now, if in case, right, the mood has already been set, it means that this is not the first message in the conversation. It is a follow-up conversation, right? Therefore, what happens is the automation goes down this path here, the path that says true, and instead it takes the form input, the message that you're put in, basically your prompt text, and prepares a user role message, right? So essentially the message to is called twice, once to prepare a system role message, another time to prepare the user role message. And that message will look something like this, right? This is your user level message. So when you begin the first conversation, the first question, when you pass in the first question, there will be at least two messages in this messages array. The first message will be the system level message. The second will be the user level message, and that is your first prompt, right? And the entire set of messages is actually maintained inside a global variable named chat context, right? So in this case, what happens? It comes in here, and then it prepares your user level message, and then it goes down and appends the user message to the context. Therefore, remember that the system level message is appended only once here at this location. And in subsequent conversations, the flow will always go on the left, right? Down this path on the left, because the mood has already been set and it's a follow-up question. And all messages that are going to be appended to the context will be user level messages, right? Now, in addition to maintaining the user level messages, which are JSON-like messages, there is another global variable called chat history text. And the messages that are going to be maintained in this variable will be in pure text form, right? And those are the same messages and responses that you see in the history, right? When you open up your notepad and look at the history, they're all in plain text format. Now, there's a reason for me to maintain two different global variables. The problem here is that when you get your messages and convert them into JSON format, if you want to maintain the history, you got to convert them back, right? From JSON back to plain text. Now that takes additional steps, right? Because if you take something like this and you want to convert it back to plain text and extract only this part of it, you have to do some work, right? So instead of doing all of that work, it is easier for us to maintain two different global variables, and one global variable will contain the messages in this format, the JSON format. The other variable, the global text history, will contain only these text messages, right? That way, it becomes easier for us to write it to the history file if you opt to save the history at the end of the conversation, right? So that is what is happening in these two steps. So there are two variables. chat context, which is the JSON form of messages, and then chat history text, which is the text form of messages, right? So this is how the message history is being recorded. And most importantly, this is what enables your ChatGPT conversation to support context. So what happens is, in a context, is you post the first question, right? You post the first question. For example, in this JSON here, you're posting the first your tone, and you're posting the first question. Now, what happens is the response is received from the model. Now, when you ask a follow-up question, you are not only appending your follow-up question, but you're also appending the response that was received, right, when you ask the previous question, right? That way, what happens is, as you keep having these conversations, the number of user messages will keep building up in this messages array, right? And that is why when we ran this test, you saw that the model was able to give us an answer even when the prompt that you posted, a follow-up question that you posted in your follow-up prompts, did not make much sense, right? And what helps the model, answer your questions is the fact that you are actually appending the context to the message history as you're having subsequent follow-up conversations with that model, right? So this is the main important and very significant feature that helps this AI context-based chatbot. Now that you have all of these basic inputs, that is your prompt, your tone, and your text, right? The next action for the automation is to compose the AI request body, right? And as I had mentioned earlier, if you look at the request body template, this is how it looks like. There is a clump of text in a pre-formatted manner, and then there are placeholders here within each of these sections of the text. And what we do is we find the placeholders and replace them with the required inputs. For example, the model is replaced with the model name, and then the temperature, the penalties, max tokens, and then finally the array of messages, right? Note that the array of messages is coming from this global variable named chat context, right? And therefore, effectively, when the messages is substituted here, it becomes an array of messages, right? Now comes the question, where are these settings coming from, right? Where are the model, temperature, presence, penalty, all of these are coming from? Now, here is another change that I made to this particular version of the application. Based on the amount of usage that I have experienced so far with ChatGPT, I have come to a preset value of temperature, presence, and frequency penalty, and I've decided to keep that constant, right? I don't need to change it every time, and that is why you are not finding the temperature or presence penalty or frequency penalty inputs on the form interface. And those settings have been moved to input arguments in the main XAML of this application, right? So here you can see that there is the chat model name, and then there are temperature, presence, frequency, and max tokens all set to certain default values, right? Now, the values that you want to maintain in your version of the application depends on the kind of conversation you're having and the satisfaction you're having with the answers received, sent by your model, right, in your conversation. If you do not like them, then what you do is you go into your assistant, and then you go into your automation, you click on the automation, and then here below are the input parameters for your context-based chatbot. And you can change those and then rerun your prompts to see what difference it makes in the quality of the responses received by received from the model, right? The problem here is you have to pass these values to the chat form, right? Not just the chat form, but to the clicked event of the ask button, right? And that is facilitated if you take these input arguments and then put them into global variables, and those global variables are accessible in the click event of the ask button, right? So here, now that you have populated all of these into global variables, you go into the ask clicked and you look at the step called compose AI request body, and you bring it up. Right? And here it can be seen that these values for model, temperature, presence penalty, etc., are being replaced by their variable, global variable counterparts, right? And it's a very simple find and replace, action. And by the time your automation steps through this, this step in the process, it should have composed your JSON body, right? If I go back to this example of the request body, you can see that all of this looks well formatted, but when you go to the right, you see that the response sent by the model has some meta characters, right? Meta characters are characters that you use for specific purposes in your programming language, right? Example, single quote, double quote, backslash, dollar, etc., right? Now, you have to delimit or escape these characters when you compose your JSON, right? For example, you have to take single, if there are double quotes within double quotes, then you have to escape them by specifying 2 double quotes, right? And similarly with backslash, you have to specify 2 backslashes instead of 1, right? So this kind of problem happens if you are going to be having a conversation that is technical in nature, right? You are talking about JSON, or you're asking it to write some code. And then once it sends the code back, that code will have all kinds of special characters. And then when you are asking a follow-up question, that message that it sent previously, all that code is going to be posted back into your JSON. And if your JSON is not sanitized or not escaped properly, then that particular follow-up conversation will break, right? Because the JSON breaks. So for that, you do a very simple action. I have tested it. It works. So far, it has worked. And if you go to the messages or the message to XAML, you will see that there is a step that actually sanitizes this JSON, and it takes the unformatted text message, which is the response sent by the model, and then it removes some of the things that you don't really require for a context to be maintained. And here, it does a simple find replace of some of the characters that we need to escape, right? You take the double quote and you replace it with 2 double quotes. You take the backslash, replace it with double backslash, and you can add as many characters that you want to escape so that the JSON does not break. Thus far, I have tested it for these, and it seems to be working in most conditions, but then further tests will reveal if there are going to be failures, right? So that is what it takes for you to actually compose this entire request body, right? First thing is the array of messages. The second thing is to make sure that the text that you're putting in here does not have any unescaped special characters, right? So now comes another issue with composing the request, right? That is the request timeout, right? What happens with context-based conversations is that the number of messages will increase your messages array. And as the size of your request increases, the timeout value must also increase proportionately, right? It must increase proportionately. So what I've done here is, based on the testing that I did, I came up with a crude algorithm, right? And if I pull that up, you will see that I take the request body length, right? And then I have actually put in a factor of 0.07 seconds. So I asked it to give me a passage of 50 words, and I measured the time. And then I took the amount of time it takes for each word to stream through, because ultimately that it's coming back as a stream, right? And it gave me a value of about 0.06 to 0.07 per word, right? After measuring it over consistently for a response that is limited to 50 words. And then I assume that there is going to be some lag, and I multiplied it 3 times, right? So that means I'm assuming that it's that particular value has got some safety built into it, right? And then I'm multiplying that to make it proportionate to the length of the request. I'm multiplying it by the request body length, right? So the larger the request, the larger is the compensation or the timeout that you've set, right? So 0.07 multiplied by 3 multiplied by the length of the body multiplied by 1,000, because you want to convert this into milliseconds, because your API request connector takes this in milliseconds, right? So you compute that value. Again, please test this out on your end, and if you need, you can enhance it, or you can actually increase or decrease it based on how your conversations turn out. So we have the request timeout millisecond variable, and this is where we actually have the request response cycle, right? Or the prompt completion cycle. So for that, we use the HTTP request connector from the web API activities. And then some of the things that you need to set here have to be noted. The first thing is obviously your request method is post. Your request URL is the standard, OpenAI URL, that the completions endpoint that's published in the OpenAI documentation. And the next item on the list is the timeout. Here you can see the timeout in milliseconds, and that was the time that we computed upstream. And then the next parameter would be your body, the request body, and we actually compose the request body, and then set this body form URL encoded, and then you pass in headers and some parameters. So the first is the headers parameter collection, and here you put in the content type and then your authorization key, right, which is your API key, bearer plus global variables.api key, right? You put in that, and the next thing would be your parameters collection, in which case you put in host, right? So once you have composed that request, you log that request to aid in debugging, right? And then you wait for the request to come back, or the chat model to respond. Remember, it will take longer based on the length of your conversation, right? And that's why we set the timeout value. And once you get that response back, you inspect the response status, and that response status is actually set in the API connector. And here are those 2 variables: response content, right? And then response status, right? So you have the response status value and then the response content. Obviously, that's the response received from your model. So you inspect the response status, right? And if it is not 200, it means that there is going to be, your request response cycle has run into an error, right? And you log the raw response, and then you take the response received, the error response, and you put it in the output where normally the user will see the response from the model, right? And that message will look something like this. You see that if there is something wrong with your request, then it will give you the list of possibilities on why it might have gone wrong. So you can pause the screen here and take a look at what these are, but you will see something like this in your form output where normally you see the output response from the model. Now, if there is no error, if it is 200, then it goes to the right. And now you deserialize the JSON, right? And you deserialize the JSON and pull it into a JSON response object. And here is where the differences come in between the previous application and this application. In this case, we are going to extract the information that we need from that JSON response object. And here you can see the response text is coming from the choices of 0 message content, right? This is how we pull the response. Then again, I pull all the information that is required for me to meter the tokens. And that is here, JSON response of usage and prompt tokens, right? So all your tokens are actually listed under the usage object of that JSON response, right? And then similarly, you pull in the total tokens, the completed tokens, and the prompt tokens. And then as we discussed before, we perform the math to maintain the count of these tokens into global variables, right? This has already been covered before, so I'm going to skip that. Now, that is not the end all and be all of parsing the model response. If you remember what I had said, in order to maintain context, you have to append the previous response of your model into the messages array, right? So what you do is you take the response and pass it into this messages or the message to XAML, right? And again, what it does is it takes in this message because the message that you're passing it is the response text that you got from your API response. You take that and you pass this into in content and you get the formatted message out. And what it does is it again sanitizes the content, converts it into JSON, and then you take that and you append it to your chat context history, right? And this is what is happening here, the chat context history. You're maintaining the messages JSON object, and in the text history, you're maintaining the text form of that object. So please take your time to go through it. It's a pretty cool concept, and I really like rebuilding the Python code into UiPath.